Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Hello everyone, welcome to today's session of the course The History of English Language and Literature. In today's lecture we shall be engaging with the age of Pope, also known as the Augustan Age. This age spreads over the reign of a few monarchs such as Queen Anne, George I of Hanover and George II of again of the House of Hanover. The Augustan Age or the Age of Pope is also known by a different set of names such as the Age of Neoclassicism, the Age of Reason, the Age of Exuberance, the Age of Scandal, and also as the Age of Enlightenment. After a period of renaissance that the English people witnessed from the age of Elizabethan times onwards, with the onset of the reign of Queen Anne and in the post-Restoration period, it's predominated by an age of enlightenment. So we begin to note that whatever happens during these different periods of time in terms of literature, politics, culture, religion, other kinds of social changes and reforms, all of that is a product of this all-encompassing sweeping movement known as the Enlightenment movement. If we begin to take a look at the political happenings in England during this point of time, especially after the reign of Charles II, we notice that it was King James II who succeeded Charles II's rule. However, he was deposed in the Glorious Revolution that happened in 1688. So, King James II ruled from February 1685 to only till 1688. James II was the second surviving son of Charles I and he was also the brother of Charles II. So, after the death of Charles II, who was heirless, we find James II assuming the throne. And we also note that James II was the last Catholic monarch of England, and he did not enjoy much of popular support because he was trying to rule over a predominantly Protestant nation. And he was also suspected of being very pro-French since he was brought up in France, and he had a lot of French influence in the ways in which he was going about his governance. He was also quite pro-Catholic, and he also had begun to show the intentions of being an absolute monarch, and this was something that the English people had begun to scorn with utmost hatred, and we also know that it had even led to the beheading of a previous monarch. So, James II, in his attempts to restore Catholicism, he almost tried to bring in a certain kind of religious liberty and harmony, which was not taken very kindly by the English people. And however, the immediate trigger for sending out James II, or the immediate trigger in rising in rebellion against James II, was the birth of a son for him. Until then, he only had two daughters who were being raised as Protestants, so that was not seen as much of a problem. And also, the birth of a son also indicated that there is a legal male heir who also, there was also a possibility of restoring Catholicism and also having another absolute monarch with a Catholic loyalty and a Catholic bent of mind. So, this was quite unacceptable to the people, and we almost find them conspiring to depose James II. So, then what happens is the Glorious Revolution of 1688, which is also known as the Bloodless Revolution of England, because there was no war waged for it, there were no internal or external conflicts. It was a very strategic kind of planning that the Parliament had undertaken. We find that this Glorious Revolution was led by none other than James II's own son-in-law and also his nephew, the William of Orange. He was also the husband of one of his daughters, Mary. In 1688, we find a group of 7 Protestant nobles who were also part of the Parliament. They invite William of Orange to come to England with an army and take over the English crown. Soon after that, since the monarch of England also ruled over Ireland and Scotland, we find them also complying to this new move, and we find that by 11th April 1689, the Parliament of Scotland declares James II to have forfeited the throne because he had already fled England, fearing this onslaught and an attack from his son-in-law and nephew William of Orange. So, we do find that by 1688, through a very smooth kind of transition, through a very bloodless kind of transition, the Glorious Revolution happens, and William of Orange and his wife Mary, who is also the daughter of James II, they assume the crown of England, and William also assumes the title of the King of England as William II. By 1701, we also find the Parliament and the other leading rulers, they also taking enough precaution in order to prevent another Catholic rule happening in England at a later point of time. So, by 1701, we find this particular Act of Settlement being passed, which also ruled that no Roman Catholic was permitted to ascend the English throne, nor could any English monarch marry a Roman Catholic. So, in that sense, James II, he was the last Catholic monarch who ruled over England. Around the same time, we continue to see the rise of political parties, and primarily Whigs and Tories. Whigs celebrated a sense of personal freedom. We also find that due to their strategic alliances with the wealthy nobles of those times, and also due to their economic and commercial policies, they stood to gain in the long run. And Tories, they were more conventional, and they continued to believe in the royal divine right. This particular period also witnessed the parliamentary union of England and Scotland. We do find that this had a lot of political implication even in the later points of time. If you remember the Scottish independence referendum, which happened in 2014, it's an indicator that there is a continuing relevance and a continuing problematization of these political unions, which took place as early as the 18th century. And this time also witnessed the succession of the Hanoverian kings, at least for the next 4 monarchs. We find the Hanoverian, the House of Hanover, dominating the English royalty for some time from now. If we begin to look at the political background of the Augustan period, we find that the inaugural moment of the Augustan period also coincides with the reign of Queen Anne. Queen Anne's reign lasted from 1702 till 1714. She succeeded to the throne after the death of her sister Mary II and her husband William III, and we notice that she was also the daughter of James II. She was raised as a Protestant on the instruction of Charles II, who was her uncle, her father's brother. Since she grew up with a lot of fervour towards the Protestant faith, she also showed a lot of devotion to the Anglican Church. So, she was quite popular among the English people during the time. She got married to Prince George of Denmark, and she was considered entirely English in all her traits, in all her belief systems, and in the ways of her life. So, she was quite popular during her times, and we do not find her getting into a lot of political entanglements during her period. But however, she was also the last Stuart monarch, and we notice that she did not have any legal heir. And it was quite a tragic kind of personal life that she had led. She had about 17 pregnancies, but there was also a series of miscarriages, stillbirths, and early deaths of her offsprings. And one of her surviving children, a male prince, he lived only till about 11 years of old. So, all of this had led to a lot of despair and a lot of melancholy in the royal family at that point of time. Queen Anne is also said to have had a lot of intellectual limitations. She was not considered as quite smart, unlike many other kings and queens of England. She also had suffered from a chronic ill health. She is said to have suffered from continuous attack of gout, which was quite painful to her. And even it said that the anecdote says that even on the day of her succession, on the day of her coronation, she had to be carried in a chair to the ceremony because she had had a very painful gout attack then. At later point, Macaulay, one of the greatest prose writers of the period, he spoke about Queen Anne in such a way that he mentions, when in good humour she was meekly stupid, and when in bad humour she was sulkily stupid. So, she's not said to have had much of an intellectual compatibility. If we look at the age of Pope, or the Augustan age, and the chief features which characterized it, we notice that London continues to remain as the centre of 18th century literature. From the medieval times onwards, London was the centre of all kinds of major activities which were happening in England. And in this time, particularly from the Augustan period onwards, the major audience of all kinds of literary and non-literary activities, it becomes the polite society which is centred in London. And we also notice that the writers of this period, they begin to write for a very civilized urban group whose education they could almost take for granted. In that sense, the audience was very limited, and also the subject matter also was tailored in such a way to cater to only to this particular kind of educated elite and urban audience. So we find literature taking a very urban kind of shift from this point of time. And also aristocracy begins to be replaced with notions of gentility and wealth. And we also notice that the motivating power in society is focused on how genteel one is. That also that is something which was not entirely based on birth, but also based on the other kinds of traits that one acquired along the lines, such as wealth, education, the other kinds of various things that fashion their personality, so on and so forth. And we also find that from this period onwards, the people begin to move away from the old idealisms, and the merchants and tradesmen, who were until that point of time, who were only seen as perfunctory in sense of contributing to the commercial aspects of English life, we find them playing an active role in the literary and cultural fashionings of England. And Glorious Revolution also had played a significant role in shaping Augustan Age, or the age of Pope, in the way it has been shaped, because it marked the victory of the town over the court, and there was also a celebration of the triumph of the Parliament. And we do not find at any later point of time the Parliament being completely taken away by the monarch or anyone else, any other royalists or the nobles. We find that the Parliament continued to play a very significant role in the shaping of politics, and also indirectly in the shaping of the literature and the other cultural forms that were to come out from the island of Britain. Education also began to signify more important things such as civilization. It was also based on a kind of calculation towards a better career. It also made people more complacent, more rational and more respectable. So education began to play an entirely different role in the shaping of the nation's future itself. Around this time, there is a separation of economics and ethics which happened, and we do not find them getting interconnected with each other. And this was also perhaps quite necessary to take forward the various policies of colonization, and also the newer emergent economic trends which were getting shaped and fashioned. Coffee houses also replaced court as the meeting place of men of culture and learning, and this also made this meeting place more leveled kind of a place, because a court was a place which many could not access. In that sense, coffee house provided a more egalitarian space, and also a more affordable and accessible place for everyone. This period also marks the arrival of the journalist. We also find matters such as gossip making its way into the print. As a result of all of these changes which were happening in the background, there is an increased emphasis on aspects of civilization and refinement, which were also the hallmarks of a well-bred person. And poetry, from this point of time, it's no longer for the common man, it becomes a civilized activity. It also becomes more socially acceptable than in the preceding ages. But however, the narrow limits imposed on the audience and also on matters of composition, it also led to a lot of narrowness in terms of its audience, in terms of its reach, and also in terms of the range which it could achieve. So compared to the earlier periods, though there were a lot of positive things happening, there was also a way in which art and literature was getting limited and getting narrowed down to particular forms and particular audiences and particular kinds of articulations. And this period, most significantly, it witnessed a tendency towards a moral regeneration. Just like in the Restoration period, there was a revolt against the dominant forms of Puritanism, and also a kind of tendency to move against the stifling aspects of Puritanism. In the Augustan Age, we find the English people mostly moving towards a moral regeneration, and there is also a revolt being shown against the restoration of profligacy. People were getting quite fed up of the kind of indecent literature which was getting promoted, the kind of moral degeneration which was happening, the celebration of anarchy. All of this was getting a little too much for the English public, and we find them craving for some kind of a normalcy, quote unquote, to be restored in the London circles, and especially in the forms of art and literature which was getting produced during that time. So this tendency proved quite fruitful in the way in which literature was about to emerge in the 18th century. So if we look at the literary features of the age, As we've noted before, it was primarily a literature of intelligence. The influence of the classical age was very notable. Latin was again revived, and we do find a lot of translations also finding its way into the London circles during this time. And but nevertheless, the flip side was that people as well as the writer, they remained quite indifferent to the beauties of nature during this time, and we find them focusing more on a descriptive and meditative kind of poetry rather than the kind of poetry which the Elizabethans loved, or the kind of poetry which was about to follow later in the Romantic Age. This period, though it's celebrated as the Augustan period and almost like a golden period in terms of classicism and the rebirth of classicism, from the present critical point of view, it's not considered as a great age. However, the term is continuing to be used for convenience of classification, because many of the later historians are of the opinion that this form cannot be compared with the early Augustan period that flourished in history. During this time also, we find the men of letters continuing to be under the patronage of powerful patrons, only that this patronage shifted from the space of the court to the other kinds of spaces, so that anyone who had a lot of wealth could afford to be patrons of art and literature. We also find a critical spirit dominating during this time, which also perhaps led to a kind of artificial society which was quite polished at the surface and continued to remain a little rotten at the core. This was the opinion that at least some of the historians had of this age at a later point of time, that in form as well as in spirit, everything was seen more sophisticated only at the surface level. So, because of this, perhaps art was also more self-conscious. It was seen as a deliberate kind of activity rather than a natural kind of activity like it was during the Elizabethan times. Middle class also emerged as an important force to reckon with. We find that the objective of literature also narrows down to the entertainment and education of this predominant middle class, which was emerging in London at that point of time. If we talk about the poetry of the age of Pope, we notice that it was mostly satire that dominated kind of writing. So, the satire was mainly directed against the public and literary figures of those times. It included a lot of criticism and even caustic mockery, but also we find that there were a few who did not want to hurt the sentiments of people a lot. So, we also find the play of gentle irony in some of the works. There was a particular kind of poets who dominated the poetic scene in London during this time. They were together collectively known as the Graveyard School of Poets. They spoke increasingly about death and decay. We shall be taking a look at them shortly. And most of the poets of this period, they were very self-conscious about the kind of poetry that they were producing. So, the subject matter was also tailor-made in such a way that it also reflected the kind of image that they wanted to portray of themselves in the society then. We find some of them being influenced by a deep spirit of humanism. For instance, we find it in the works of Goldsmith, Gray, and even Alexander Pope. And many of the writings, if we survey them at a later point of time, it seems as if they had already accepted the premise of enlightenment. We find it getting reflected in the treatment, in the choice of subject matter, etc. The pastoral influence of the earlier times also continued to dominate. And more than everything, we do find that there is a predominance of classical learning and classical authors during this time. This now leads us to take a look at what exactly constituted the classical school of poetry. The historian Hudson talks about 5 different characteristics that would define a classical school of poetry. First of all, it was a product of intelligence, and it was a poetry of argument, of criticism, of politics and personality. It had a lot of topical relevance in that sense. And it was the flip side was that it was deficient on the side of emotion and imagination. Secondly, it was mostly a town poetry for various political and social reasons, and the flip side again was that it neglected the humbler aspects of life. There was no one writing much about nature, about landscape, about country things, or not even about common people. Thirdly, this poetry was found to be wanting quite severely in romantic elements. Romantic here is used as an epithet to talk about all kinds of things which perhaps characterize the finer aspects of life. And in that sense, the critics of this time, they were unsympathetic even towards the earlier stalwarts such as Chaucer, Spenser, and even towards Shakespeare's poetry. Fourthly, there was an extreme sense of devotion to form. This was mostly superficial and at the surface level. We also find this leading to a lot of artificial and conventional style of articulation. For example, even simple statements were converted into elaborated ornamented style of rendition. For example, a statement such as "God rest his soul." In the Augustan time, it was converted into "eternal blessings on his shade attend." So, this was considered as a more polished and more sophisticated in the Augustan times. Especially many of the poets thought that this also rendered a certain classical touch to otherwise pedestrian form of expression. It was to this form of ornamentation and this sort of extravagant articulation that Wordsworth was to register his emphatic protest at a later point of time. Fifthly and finally, this sort of poetry, it adhered to the closed couplet as the only possible form for serious work in verse. This grew monotonous in the long run, and it also primarily because closed couplet was too narrow and inflexible. In that sense, we also find them not getting a permanent place in poetry, especially in terms of the literary and critical qualities. Moving on, let us take a look at the major writers of this period. Particularly in this lecture, we shall be taking a look at the major poets which dominated the Augustan age in England during that time. Alexander Pope was born in 1688. This year is very significant in the history of English history and literature. This was the year of the Glorious Revolution and also the year of Bunyan's death, John Bunyan's death. Pope was born into a Roman Catholic family, and he also had received only a very haphazard form of formal education. So, in that sense, he was never considered as an accurate scholar. He did manage to teach himself quite a lot of things, but that was not quite scholarly and never up to the mark compared to many of the other university educated writers. And since his upbringing was mostly Catholic, he also suffered a lot on account of that. During that time, the Catholics were looked down upon, and they were also treated with a lot of suspicion. They could not sit in the parliament, they were not allowed to hold any kind of offices. We also note that the Act of Settlement also ensured that no Catholic monarch was ever to come to power in England. So, this was the kind of attitude that Protestant England had towards the Catholics then. So, because of that, Pope could not fare very well among his circles. He was constantly criticized and attacked in the media on account of this belief that he held. And because of this, and also because of the chronic ill health that he suffered throughout, he had very bad relations with his contemporaries. He never liked any of them, and we also find the others making a lot of caustic remarks about Pope himself. And at later point, it's mentioned about Pope's relations with his contemporaries, that it was a tangled record of miserable jealousies and quarrels. And in his poetry also we find this getting reflected. He was quite supreme in the art of making caustic attacks and caustic remarks at his rivals. For instance, he was acquainted for a while with Wycherley, who was one of the Restoration writers. But however, Pope fell out of him at a later point of time. He even declared his verse to be worthless, and we do not find them coming together again for any kind of literary purpose. Pope's work could be classified into three different periods: an early period and a late period of original work, and in between a short period of translation. The early period of Pope's writings were before the year 1750. It was mostly a collection of miscellaneous poems without sticking to any particular kind of subject matter or form. We find him writing 4 pastorals during this time, dedicated to 4 seasons, to spring, summer, autumn and winter. And this poetry was also fashioned on Virgil, and we do find a kind of artificial manner creeping into this. If you remember, the influence of classicism was quite great on Pope's poetry. Another important work of this early period was the Messiah, which was a poetic rendering of the messianic passages in the book of Isaiah of the Bible. This work was also considered hugely popular and interesting during that time. With Windsor Forest, another poem of his, we find him getting into a newer kind of writing known as topographical poetry, and this is a kind of poetry which described a landscape from a vantage point of time. He was one of the pioneers in this kind of writing in England. And the other significant work was the essay on criticism. This was written at a very young age of 21. It was a popular interpretation of the literary creed of the age. However, it was criticized for being not very original. Pope was inspired heavily by the classic writers, and we do find many of their tenets making into his own writing. So, some of them which Pope himself thought was very original were not actually that original. He was mostly inspired by Horace's Ars Poetica and Boileau's Art Poetic. So we find a lot of not just inspiration, even a kind of blind copying from the earlier masters, finding its way into Pope's writing as well. Poems was a set of two narrative poems put together. The other important works of this early period were Elegy to the Memory of an Unfortunate Lady, Eloisa to Abelet, and a tragic love story which was cast in Ovid's style. Perhaps the most important work and to a satire of this early period was The Rape of the Lock, and this poem was fashioned in the form of a mock heroic epic. This is also considered as Pope's masterpiece. This work initially appeared in 1712 in Lintet's Miscellanies. The basic plot for this poem, it was based on a real life incident, which was a practical joke played by a certain Lord Peter, who had cut a lock of hair from the head of a young woman named Arabella Firma. So this joke, in fact, it led to a feud between two prominent families, and it had even caused a lot of amusement and a lot of interest to the contemporary people then. Pope, in order to make fun of the entire incident and also to show how this sort of a trivial incident had the power to even invoke hostilities between two prominent families, he decided to compose this mock heroic epic. It was celebrated as a heroic comical kind of work of that time, and we find Pope engaging with trivial occurrences of those times, especially as part of this particular incident. We find him handling these trivial occurrences with a lot of dignity and seriousness that belong to an epic. So, in that sense, the treatment was considered very perfect, and he is also considered as perhaps the most important writer of work of this kind. Matthew Arnold, at a later point of time, he even acknowledged and celebrated this poem as a criticism of life. So this work was quite it was quite popular during the time, and it also had inspired many others to try mock heroic kind of epics in order to efficiently articulate their satirical writings. The second period in Pope's writing career was a period of translation which lasted from 1715 till 1725. During this period, he attempted two major translations of Iliad and Odyssey. However, this work was not considered as a faithful translation either, because it was mostly like a version of Pope's own Homer. There was more of Pope in his translations than of Homer, because due to the various limitations that he had and due to the limitations of the age itself, it said that neither Pope nor his age could understand or enter into the spirit of Homer or the Homeric world. However, he is credited to have produced a version, a translation of Homer, which the public really accepted, because it was more readable than the complex kind of rendition which was part of Iliad and Odyssey of Homer. And it's generally said of this particular work, by this particular translation by Pope, that it had every merit except fidelity to the original. The third period was dominated by a lot of satiric and didactic writings, and he imitated, even for his satirical writings, he imitated the masters of the old classical period, and we find him imitating Horace in most of these works which were produced at a later point of time. And the epistle to Dr. Arbuthnot in this work was hugely popular during that time, because he had satirized Joseph Addison, a prominent prose writer of the period. In this work, we also find him mocking and attacking a lot of commoners having high and lofty aspirations in terms of art. The important and the most popular work of this period was perhaps the Dunciad series. Duns, in fact, refer to bad poets of those times. It was also modelled on Macflecknoe, the product of an earlier age, written by Dryden. His work, the Dunciad series, it had come out in at three different points of time. There were three different sets which were produced at different points of time, in 1728, in 1729, in 1742, and in 1743. All of these, this series, in fact, it attacked the bad poets of those times. And since the characters remained obscure and they were not known to a reader of a later time, it also destroyed much of its relevance and much of its humor, because the modern reader is reading about someone who is not at all popular, someone who is not at all recorded in history, other than these poetic references by Pope. But apart from that, we do find that Pope had tried a lot through his satires to expose the society's vices and also its ignorant tendencies in spite of the high lofty artistic aspirations it had. So, we also find him critiquing class, critiquing a lot of vices and a lot of follies which were part of the Augustan world of England during that point of time. The important work which also showed Pope's interest in philosophy was that of Essay on Man. Though the work was titled an essay, it was actually a poem in 4 epistles. So, we find him writing this in defense of the moral government of the universe, and he also he goes on to ask a lot of philosophical questions in this work. But however, the limitation was that Pope was not a philosopher at all, and he did not have any kind of natural leanings towards the learning of philosophy or to the articulation of philosophy, and he had not received any kind of formal training in philosophy. So, his work was mostly through the influence of others and through the kind of readings that he had acquired. We find that in these philosophical renditions, he was hopelessly confused, and he also self-contradicts a lot, and however it is celebrated for the rhetorical beauty and power it had. So, we find that apart from a couple of poetical renditions by Pope, we do not find him being rated as one of the great masters in English literature. Nevertheless, the age gets known by his name as the age of Pope due to the prolific kind of work that he produced, and also due to the great influence that he had in terms of the neoclassical influences. Some of the oft quoted lines in English language, it has come from many of Pope's writings. For example, a little knowledge is a dangerous thing. God said, let Newton be, and all was light. The proper study of mankind is man. To err is human, to forgive is divine. Fools rush in where angels fear to tread. These are some of the common sayings which has become part of English language, and many of us even use this without knowing that it all originated in the poetry and the epistles of Alexander Pope. So, this was a major contribution that Pope gave not just to English literature, but also to the evolution of English language. Now, let us take a look at another major influence which was collectively known as the Graveyard School of Poetry. They were mostly obsessed with the spirit of melancholy and despair, and this was even seen as an English malady during those times. Elegy was the most commonest form of expression of the Graveyard School of Poets, and they were also concerned with aspects of human mortality, decay, aging, death, etc. It said that in terms of form and in terms of treatment and subject matter, they also anticipated the Gothic novel. Some of the important writers of this period included Robert Burton and his work The Anatomy of Melancholy, Thomas Gray's Elegy written in the country churchyard. This is perhaps the most important work of the Graveyard School of Poets. Thomas Parnell's Night Piece on Death, Edward Young's Night Thoughts, which was written in the form of an epic, and Robert Blair's The Grave. We do find that even in the titles there is a kind of melancholy and there is a kind of gloominess built into it. The other important verse writers of this period included John Gay. His trivia, it was a travesty of the Beggar's Opera, which was a very prominent and a very famous French work, and this work is also said to have taken the town by storm. William Somerville's work The Chase, Sir Samuel Garth's The Dispensary, James Thomson's The Seasons, these were all prominent works of those times by certain noteworthy writers. And John Dyer's Grongar Hill was not hugely popular then, but later it said that Wordsworth had greatly admired this work. And Mark Akenside's The Pleasures of the Imagination, it was a work which was didactic in nature. It also had aspects of aesthetic theory and discussion about aesthetics built into it. Robert Dodsley was also another significant writer of those times. Christopher Smart, his claim to fame was not just through his writings, but he is said to have displayed a lot of religious mania. He was also put into an asylum at a later point of time towards the end of his life. William Collins and Joseph Warton continued to write during this time, and though their works were not hugely popular, it is worthy to mention these names in order to show the kind of literary output that the age of Pope or the Augustan age had. Thomas Percy was one writer who also showed a lot of interest in antiquarianism, and his work Relics of Ancient English Poetry, it was a collection of ballads which was published in 1765. Even at a later point of time, we find this work exerting a lot of influence in the age of Romanticism as well. Thomas Chatterton was a very interesting figure of these times. He claimed to have discovered a particular medieval 15th century poet named Thomas Rowley, and he claimed that this poet, this poem, he claimed that this poet and his works were forgotten, and he claimed to have unearthed them from obscurity and from the past. But however, the other major historians such as Horace Walpole, they contend these claims as forgeries as well. And we do find that Thomas Chatterton, he meets a very tragic death. He commits to suicide at the age of 18. There were no major kind of works that he produced apart from this yet unfounded kind of claim about the discovery of this poet Thomas Rowley. But however, his death and his life and his tragic death is said to have inspired a lot of romantic poets at a later point of time. Coleridge, for instance, he wrote this particular poem, Monody, on the death of Chatterton, as a tribute to this very young, promising person who also met with a tragic end. And Wordsworth, in fact, he even created a particular myth around this boy genius. That's how he had described, that's how Wordsworth had described Chatterton. He is also said to have penned these two lines in his memory: the marvellous boy, the sleepless soul that perished in his pride. So we find that these a lot of different kinds of tendencies and a lot of different kinds of influences had shaped not just the literature of the period, but also the spirit, the general thinking. Through this, we find that a lot of literary and non-literary tendencies were also getting shaped by the major influences of enlightenment, the spirit of discovery, and also the spirit of going back to the past and bringing a lot of mythical characters and a lot of characters from the past alive. So, let us wind up this lecture by drawing our attention to two major poets of this time who also is said to have signalled or marked a transition towards a romantic age dominated by Wordsworth and others. William Cowper had published a set of his works under the title Poems, and some of his major works included On the Loss of the Royal George, John Kilpin's Ride, which was also humorous. The Task, which was written in blank verse, unlike most of the poems of those times. It was also written in the style of reportage. In this work, The Task, we also find him talking about a lot of events from all around the world, including India. If you remember, this was also the age which saw the heightened influence of colonization. We find many poets getting interested in a lot of things which were happening in the world which was outside England and London. So, we also find interestingly in this poem Task a lot of references to Brahminical rites which were happening in India at that point of time. The other important poet who is said to have signalled a transition towards the Romantic age is Robert Burns. His work concerned with humanity, the countryside and nature, quite in contrast with the dominant form of writing in the Augustan age, which was classical and hence removed from all these finer kinds of notions. He also spoke a lot about the labourers a lot, which was hardly ever discussed because the poetry of the neoclassical age, poetry of the Augustan age was predominantly town-centric. He was also a critique of class inequality, which made him quite endearing to the romantics at a later point of time. He composed satires and love songs. It included The Holy Fair, The Cotter's Saturday Night, Mary Morrison and Duncan Gray. So, with this we come to an end to a discussion on the poetic articulations of the Augustan period. In the next lecture, we shall be focusing on the various kinds of prose writings that dominated the Augustan period. So, that is all we have for today's lecture. Thank you for listening and look forward to seeing you in the next session.